Hello, ghouls and gals. We're taking a little break from our listicle pieces to go back to one of my favourite things in Warhammer. In both 40k and fantasy, the Warhammer settings are full of magical creatures, species that exceed a human's strength and smarts by 100-fold, and yet despite it all, the human race has not yet died out. In such horrible places, normal blokes still choose to live, when honestly, I would have found the best hiding spot and just crawled in there to die. Last time we looked at one of these based males, we looked at Toddy, the man who nearly became emperor. But today we're stepping up on the imperial political ladder to examine Karl Franz, the man who did rule the empire, and in my opinion was the best emperor the world ever saw. Born to former emperor Luitpold I, Karl Franz was destined to be an electicant from birth, but he was not automatically granted his father's title, nor was he necessarily guaranteed to make it past his first few years of living. The Warhammer world is harsh, as we know, and when Karl Franz was just an infant, he and his father were attacked on the road by beastmen. Their Reichsguard fought valiantly, but were overwhelmed by Gorgons, and when all looked bleak, out from the Reichwald forest came an ambush of wood elves, who slaughtered the beastmen and disappeared without a trace. Beastmen, being so bold in the heart of the Empire, might sound strange, but these were different times. Since the Great War against Chaos, the influence of the four ruinous powers had grown over time, and was reaching its peak during Karl Franz's youth. During this period, Luitpold wasn't the most effective ruler, but neither was his son, as young Karl loved his gambling dens and his taverns. As he grew older, Karl Franz abandoned these pursuits, especially so when his first son, Luitpold, was born. Stories differ about Karl Franz's son and family life, and I won't be diving too deep into them due to this, but we're going with the version where he never married but did have two sons, by his first cousin, if all is to be believed. Franz's family is never really an important aspect of his character or his life, and it seems matters of state always took precedence, especially when he rose to the throne, so this is all we're going to be talking about in his family. For a time, Karl Franz did not intend on taking the imperial throne, but he had been advised to run for the seat when his father passed peacefully in his sleep. On his way to Altdorf, Franz was yet again ambushed on the road. This time, it was a tribe of night goblins that sought to end the future emperor's reign before it even began. Franz fought valiantly along with his escort, defeating a goblin shaman and their arachnarok spider on his own. Even after the death of the Greenskins, the fight wasn't over, as one of the Reichsguard, travelling with Karl Franz, pulled a blade on him and tried to assassinate him. An assist from the Green Knight saved Franz's life, and the spectral protector of Bretonnia said that the young Karl must go and visit Luan Leoncoeur, who himself was only 2 years into his reign. When Luan met Karl, sparks didn't necessarily fly between the two, as the Bretonnian king told Franz that it wasn't he who had ordered the meeting, but the lady herself. Luan had been granted a vision, you see, one of a great chaos horde, an impossibly large and unstoppable army from the north that would take over Kislev, the Empire, and Bretonnia, unless Karl Franz was the one to rule the Empire. No pressure, said Luan, but if you don't rule the Empire, we're all gonna die. I don't know about you, but that sounds like a pretty good reason to throw your hat in the ring to see if you can lead your country to glory. When Karl Franz did show up to Altdorf for the election, though, there was a clear favourite already. Boris Todbringer, Toddy, the electicount of Midland, was an experienced statesman and general who found favour with the god Ulrich. Karl Franz, on the other hand, was 32 when he was running for emperor. This was seen as far too young by many, and he was also seen as inexperienced martially, having neither proven himself proper as a general or duelist. The first count gave Karl only 3 votes for the election. It wasn't actually Karl Franz that proved himself to be the right choice over Boris, and instead it was Maximilian von Königswald who managed to win most of the electicounts around, and in an incredibly tight election, Karl Franz got his win and the imperial throne along with it. Still, he had to prove he was the right choice, especially after so many had yet to be convinced of it. This gave Karl Franz a chip on his shoulder, and so he immediately set out to earn the respect of the Empire. His first great move was amassing a huge army and marching to Nordland, where he decimated a raid of Norscan tribes, barely losing any of his own men as he shredded through their ranks with crossbow volleys and bullets. Karl Franz here began to prove that he was one of, if not the greatest generals of his time, but the first major test of that came when a band of rampaging minotaurs were pushed into the Reichland by spellweavers of Athel-Loren. Rather than risk the bloodthirsty beasts coming to their own lands, the Wood Elves simply shoved them to somewhere else, like Bikini Bottom being shoved to another location to avoid the Alaskan bullworm. Karl Franz knew this had happened, and he remembered how the Wood Elves had saved him as a wee lad, so rather than despise the Forest Dwellers for this, he travelled to their home and sought their aid. Begrudgingly, the King of the Hunt, Orion, saw the logic in Karl Franz's argument, and so he set off with an army of his own to meet the Minotaurs in battle. The fighting was fierce, but with the Wood Elves by his side, it seemed Karl Franz would rid the Empire of this Minotaur herd. However, the more the Minotaurs bled, and the more they killed, the higher their frenzy rose, until they eventually broke the Empire lines, and their Doombull leader met Karl Franz in battle. After being reminded the Empire would not survive without Karl Franz, Orion dove into battle to save the new Emperor, fighting off 60 of the Minotaur's champions and earning dozens of wounds on his own body. Karl Franz, left unconscious from his fight with the Doombull, never got a chance to thank Orion for his aid, as when he woke up the Wood Elves had left without a word. In time, however, Wood Elf emissaries came to Altdorf and delivered a single griffin egg. That egg grew to be Deathclaw, the finest griffin that ever lived, and Karl Franz's most trusted friend and mount. Karl Franz continuously proved himself, as he had with the Wood Elves, to not only be an effective fighter, but also an emperor that knew politics better than any other. His skill in diplomacy was unmatched, and his strategy was not to give people what they wanted, but to give them what they knew others wished for. This strategy got the merchant guilds to sign the Convention of the Stink Act, which cleaned up Altdorf because they thought it meant their rivals would suffer. Throughout his reign, the Imperial School of Engineering developed new and deadlier war machines for the benefit of the Imperial Army, while the colleges of magic grew in strength and size, aiding the Imperial Army in victory after victory. And all the while, Karl Franz managed to keep his rule just and under a strong moral standing. He even managed to keep both the cults of Ulrich and Sigmar in his favour, even if he himself never really worshipped the old god and instead prayed mostly to Sigmar. Even if Karl Franz did reign true and well, this doesn't mean that throughout his time on the imperial throne, all was good, and there were weaker moments. First, there was the assassination attempt by Oswald von Königswald, who invited Karl Franz to his home to see a play after the death of his dear friend Maximilian von Königswald. Oswald tried to have the emperor sacrificed and even managed to cut his throat. Luckily, our hero survived, but his throat had been sliced so bad he had to speak in whispers for a time. There was a plan by the Skaven to replace Karl Franz with a doppelganger shortly after, and then a couple years after that, there came the turmoil, where Karl Franz made a series of decisions which had his subjects questioning his sanity and believing he'd been overtaken. During the turmoil, he was afflicted with a strange illness, and the first thing he did, which set alarm bells ringing, was to annex Ubersreich and strip the established Jungfreud family of all its rights and powers, something which had frightened the other noble families. Well, the older noble families. The younger ones were quite happy to get free land and money. While he was ill as well, a doppelganger had been used to keep the appearance of strength up. However, this backfired horribly when during a heated conclave meeting, Boris Todbringer drew his runefang and it clashed with the fake Galmaraz the doppelganger had been carrying around. Now, if you think of Warhammer for a minute, you can imagine the Warhammer used to forge the Empire in the first place is quite the important relic, and to see it smashed was quite the poor omen for those involved. Luckily, the real Galmaraz was retrieved, but then, unluckily, a bunch of demons appeared all over the Empire soon after. Once this invasion had been dealt with, Karl Franz found himself cured of his illness and reorganised the Empire in the greatest unification since the age of Magnus the Pious. The first test of this new empire was at the Battle of Blackfire Pass, where Vorbad Ironjaw and his War sought to wreak havoc on the Empire. Marius Leitdorf, the Mad Count of Averland, warned Karl Franz of the oncoming horde, and the two elected counts rode out to meet Ironjaw on the field of battle. At first, things were going well, though the battle looked to be long and the green tide almost endless. Early on in the fighting, Deathclaw was wounded when taking down a giant, and while he and his rider were pulled away to safety, Vorbad took his chance and pushed in hard. Without their leader at the fore, the Imperials were cut down, leaving only Marius Leitdorf and a regiment of greatswords in the centre of the savage greenskins. Vorbad cut his way through the greatswords, mounted on a massive boar, and met Leitdorf in battle. The Mad Count disemboweled Vorbad's mount, but was too weak to take down the war boss in single combat. It was then left to a returning Karl Franz to beat Vorbad, and even though he was less than half the size of his enemy, he stood against him all the same. Franz was quick and smart, but even with these advantages he couldn't match the strength of his opponent. Soon enough, Vorbad had the Emperor down on one knee and was readying for a final blow. Knowing death was whispering in his ear, Franz made one final prayer to Sigmar. Just before the blade of the war boss struck, a golden aura surrounded the Emperor, and with one mighty blow of Galmaraz, the skull of Vorbad cracked and hit the ground. From that day until his last day, Karl Franz proved himself to be an incredible leader for the Empire. seeing it prosper even as the great threat of chaos loomed and grew in the distance. Despite all his hard work, though, Karl Franz was not the destined saviour the lady had thought him to be, and as for everything else in the old world, the end times came calling for him. In the early days when the twin-tailed comet had appeared, but the threat of chaos had not yet reared its ugly head, another threat had come to Karl Franz, a lot closer to home. The boy Volton was said to be Sigmar reborn, an heir to the Imperial throne that challenged Franz's leadership. Again, we see how tactile Karl Franz was, as when the youngster was brought to him, rather than label him a pretender, he gave Volton Galmaraz, to signify him as a spiritual leader in the Empire, while Franz remained one in state and all legality. Not long after, Chaos invasions destroyed Kislev and threatened Talabek land. Karl Franz and an Imperial host rode out to meet these enemies, but after a duel with the Chaos champion, the Emperor fell in front of his entire army, leading to them shattering and retreating back to Altdorf. Karl Franz had not died, but was wounded, and then had to make his way back through enemy lines in order to reach Altdorf before it could be taken by a great army of Nurgle. He did not arrive in time to stop the siege, but instead flew directly into the thick of the fighting, looking to protect the Imperial Palace from the oncoming Glotkin. Karl Franz, Kurt Helborg, and Gregor Martak fought the three pestilent brothers, but faced utter defeat. Helborg gave his life protecting the Emperor, who in turn died moments later, but not before he could again ask Sigmar for a final act of assistance. From the floor, Karl Franz's body rose, and he wiped the forces of Nurgle from his city. After this, the Emperor did lead his people to the end times, but he was not Karl Franz at this point, as Sigmar instead used his body as a puppet in order to return to the mortal world. That disappointing ending is how we see the finest Emperor of the old world die. Karl Franz was not powerful, nor was he an incredible duelist, but for him to be cast aside in this manner feels hollow, and is one of my least favourite parts of the end times. The Siege of Altdorf is full of stupid moments, but this is where it became most clear the bad guys were going to win because of nothing more than silly plot armour. But yeah, anyway, that's the story of Karl Franz. Do you think he's the best Emperor? I sure do. As always, let me know any thoughts, any suggestions for future videos, and anything else you want to talk about in the comments. Also, hit all your favourite buttons, you know the drill. Until then, I'll be seeing you.